Hey everybody, Kevin here. In this video, we're going to be building out our models so that we can interact with the database. What good is a database that we just created, this WP flights table, if we can't interact with it in PHP? So that's why we need models in the MVC, the M part of the acronym there, Model View Controller. And so we need to understand this relationship that this database is going to have with our other data structures. So then we know how to, within the model itself, to build those relationships out using code. So again, these tables exist within WordPress now that we've run the migration. However, the program itself, our application in WordPress, doesn't know how these things are connected and how to get them to talk to each other. And that's why we need these models. Now, before we jump into the models, let's understand the relationship first, so then we can build out that relationship with the models. And so the first thing that we note is we have this flights table, and then we're going to be hooking in a custom post type of seat into this seat ID bucket. So that's how we're going to connect this table to that table, is using this post ID, and then that particular model that we will build out for this will be scoped to just the seat post type. And then we're going to connect the user's database table to the flights table and connect that via the customer ID, which will be essentially the user's ID. Now, if we were using standard conventions, we would call this essentially our junction table, where the seats and the users connect, okay? So this would be like WP underscore seats underscore users, and that would be the conventional name. However, we're calling this WP flight underscore flights because we want to go with more of a domain-specific language in this particular application. And then instead of user ID, which we very well could use, we're just going to use customer ID. Again, not trying to make it confusing. We're just using more domain-specific language in this particular application. So this is our database table. And we'll also see that these posts and users, it's a many-to-many relationship through this junction table of WP flights. So we're essentially going to need models for all of these things. We're going to need a model for our specific post type scoped against this database, which will be like a seat model. We're going to need a flight model to connect to this flight database table. And we're going to need a user model to connect to the users. And then we're going to use relationship methods on those models to bring them all together and get them connected and talking. And then we can do some really interesting things with that. So I know that's a mouthful or an earful or whatever you want to call it, but we're going to jump into this, and I think you're going to get it by the end, and it's going to be very elegant in terms of how we can pull off some really neat interactions with our database without having to write some crazy SQL code. This is going to eliminate our need for writing custom SQL. So to get started, let's look at this WP users model that comes out of the box with TypeRocket. And this model is pretty simple. It lives inside of our app under our theme here, app, models, and this is where all the models live. It's this user file. And in this user file, we tell it we want to use the app namespace of models, and that's the namespace we'll use for all of our models. And then we're going to pull in some predefined model code by extending this WP user class. And that's what user is going to be. And if I jump into this WP user, we'll see that it implements the model class itself. And these classes are going to give us access to some really neat methods. Okay, so lots and lots of methods we can update, delete, create. And if I go into the main model class, we'll see that there's a lot of neat things that we can get. We can set properties, we can append, we can do where statements and that sort of thing. So I know I'm going fast through all this. I'm just demonstrating that these models are very powerful and we can do a lot with them, so we don't have to write SQL code. Now, our user has already set up for us out of the box with TypeRocket because we already have these databases tables when we install WordPress. So TypeRocket's going to go ahead and assemble the needed models to go ahead and start interacting with all this for us. So the good news is we don't have to set up a users table. We just have to tell this our user model. We just have to tell this user model how to connect to our flights database table. However, this flights database table is new, and we're going to need a model for that. And to create models in TypeRocket, we're going to use the Galaxy CLI. Now, if you wanted to, you could follow this same practical convention and create this file manually. So we could create a file under models and we could call it flight. And then we could give it the namespace and we could extend that main model class that we saw earlier, okay? So we would just extend this TypeRocket model class. However, we don't want to write all that code every time we want to create a model because we may be creating several of them in our application. So we're going to use TypeRocket or the Galaxy CLI to achieve creation of this. Now, when using the Galaxy CLI, again, make sure it's in the root of your WordPress directory so it's all connected, and then make sure that when you're in your terminal that you have access to that CLI. So PHP Galaxy, make sure we have access to the command. And then we care about are these make commands for this tutorial, primarily the make model command. So make new model. So PHP Galaxy make model. And again, all this is doing is creating a PHP model file for us. And it tells us that we need to fill out some information. Do we want a controller-C option? Means, hey, do we want to create a controller when we create this particular model? And then a directive and a name. Now the directive is our template file. So I'm going to say, hey, let's go ahead and create a controller since we're going to do that in later videos. So -C. Then our directive is going to be base. And that just means use the base model class instead of, for example, one of these WP user classes. Or if I scroll up here, this post, we have like a post type of WP post model. So that would be a different type of model, but we just want the base for this flights table. So flight. And then when I run this, it's going to go ahead and create our flight model and then our flight controller. And let's go here. And we'll see here we have essentially our information set up for us. Now, one thing that you'll note is this resource property is called flights. And this essentially should be the name of whatever your database table is called, right? So if it's flights underscore happy, just for the lack of thinking of a word there, then it would be flights happy, okay? We exclude the WP in this because the prefix could be different for different installations that you have. So we have the flights here, and then just to show you, we have this flight controller set up, and we'll walk into how to fill out all these later. So here we are, we have our flights model created, and now we need one for that seat, okay? So let's go through here, and instead of base, we're going to use post, and this is going to create a model for the seat post type that we'll be creating in a little while. So go ahead and create that, and we also have a seat controller, and then let's see, here we are, the seat controller. It's using the post controller, which is quite nice, and it tells us that we're using this model class over here under seat, and our post type for this is seat. And we don't have to tell it what database table to use because we're using this WP post model, which already knows to use this posts database table. And this constant here of post type essentially scopes the values and the records that we're going to search within this model to just that post type. So that's how we're getting around this kind of convention that WordPress has where it just throws all your data types into one table as we get to scope our models here. So I'm going to close out the seat section, and then we'll have this in place. So the first thing that we wanted to do was we wanted to connect our database tables together, right? So the next step that we have to do here is to connect these two database tables to flights and essentially declare it as a belongs to relationship. So let's build that connection in our database here. We're going to say public function customer, and we could call this users, we could call it anything that we want, but essentially we want to return a belongs to relationship to the user model, and we want to say that it has this customer ID as the database table ID. So if I go to flights here, we'll see that customer ID is the database column that I want to connect to this user's database table. Okay, and so now that that is in place, I want to connect to my seat and have belongs one as to there as well, right? function. I have one seat, and then it will return a relationship of belongs to seat, and then we'll do the class here, and then it is seat ID. And that's all we need to connect our flights to our customer and to our seat. However, we need to do the inverse of this, right? We need to say that our customers have many seats and our seats have many, I'm getting a little confused. We need to say that our customers or our users can have many flights and our seats can have many flights. So we'll go ahead and connect our seat model here. We'll say public function, and we'll say flights, and we'll return this has many, and then we'll do flight class. Then let's see what it says. Foreign key ID. So that will be the seat ID. We will save that. And then we'll go to users and do the same. And then all of our relationships here are set up. So with that code, we've essentially wired and connected all of these things together, and they can begin to talk to each other. However, these two particular models can't talk to each other yet. And this is a many-to-many relationship. So let's go ahead and build that out now in the code. So here in our users model, we want to get the seats that belong to this user. And so we will return this belongs to many. So what many things do we belong to? We belong to seats. So we'll do seat here and do class. And then what table do we connect to our seats through? Well, it's the WP flights table. However, we want to make sure that we grab the WP database object. So we'll do global. And this is so we can get our prefix, essentially. WPDB, I believe it is. And then this is just to give some type hinting using PHP Storm. So it's kind of nice. Let's see, WPDB. And then make sure that we have that here. And we will make sure that we use the prefix here. So let's get that prefix. And then we can say flights. And that'll be our flights table. And then what else do we need? So once we have the junction table, we need the column ID that we care about. And this is the column ID for our seats, which is first. So seat ID. And this is within the junction table. And then our user column ID, which is customer ID here. So this is what we need. And then I will go ahead and copy this right here. And then we will jump over to our seat model. Where did you go? Okay. Push this in here. And then this is going to be customers. This is going to be the customers. Instead of seat, it will be user. And then this will be users. Oh, sorry. It's still flights. It's our junction table. And then we'll just kind of reverse these out, right? Customer ID here and seat ID. And that should be what we need to make all of our connections. So now we can pull back the seats customers. We can pull back the flights for that seat. For the flight, we can get the customer for that one or the seat for that one. And then for users, we can get the flights and the seats. And with this, we should be able to query the database and pull back some information. Now, I already have the data in this database for all of these models, even though I haven't necessarily registered a post type yet in this tutorial. I have pre-populated it so we can kind of see what this looks like. Now, one easy way to see how this all looks is to go and create a route. Now, this will be a front-end route for TypeRocket on the WordPress side, and we want to respond to GET requests. If you're not familiar with routes, I'm not going to cover it in this tutorial. I'm just going to kind of move through, but you can locate your routes under this public routes public folder. And then we're going to register a route, and this GET means respond on a GET request. If I wanted to respond on a POST request, I would then add it back in, and now it will respond on a GET and a POST request. And then here we're going to say for the URL flights, we're going to pass a function here. And this function will essentially look up some data for us. And so we will return a model. Let's get a flight model, and we'll get a new instance of that. And then what we will say is find flight of ID 1. Okay, and just jump over to the database here and make sure that we do have a record of 1 here. Okay, ID of 1, we're going to pull this record. And it's going to pull the seat ID of 1 and customer ID of 1. As we look at the route, we will only see the flight information. We won't see the relationship data unless we tell it we want that. But let's just look at this for now, and then we'll move into querying that database. And we'll see that we do indeed pull back some data from the database, and TypeRocket's been nice enough to us to format our essentially PHP object, the instance of the class, as an object, and it's formatted it to JSON. So just like that, we have a JSON API if we wanted it, and I have a little Chrome plugin that's sort of making this look nice. So here we can see we have our data. However, our relationships can now really tap in and give us more power in terms of what this looks like. So let's go ahead and add or pull in our user and our seat in terms of the model information. And we can do that in this route using essentially eager loading. So in our model call here, we just need to say with, and then we just give it an array of information, and we say we want our customer. And this name here is essentially mapping, if we go to flight, it's mapping to this method. So when we call with, we're saying, hey, with this customer method. And when it calls the customer method, it'll be smart enough to pull in this user class that's specific to the customer related to this flight. And we can do the same for seat. We can pass in multiple things that we want to pull in. So let's go over here and let's pull in customer. That's why I used an array here, and seat. And this will pull in both the customer and the seat with our record on the front end. Refresh the page here, and now we have the customer and the seat and all that information that comes with it. However, we could go a little bit further with this. We could say, hey, let's get the customer, which has a user, and because TypeRocket already has these relationships mapped out for us with the other models, for example, posts, we can say, hey, give me the blog posts for this customer as well. So let's do that. Let's do customer.posts. And when we do dot, it's simply going to dive into the customer model here. And then it's going to take that customer model and then look for the posts relationship on that model. So if we go to user for flights, we have customer, and then it's going to jump into this user class. And we don't see posts here, but if we go to this WP users model, we will see somewhere in here posts. All right, it has many posts. So this is the same exact methodology, except we're doing posts. And that's how we can kind of dive deeply into each one of these. If we go to WP posts, we could look into this and see if there's any other relationships. So we could go as deep as we want to. And let's see if we have anything in here that we can query that has a relationship. I'm looking for the metadata. Oh, here we go. Yeah, has many metadata. So we can do meta for that as well. So let's go over to our route. We'll do posts, and then we'll do meta. So it's going to pull in the customer, all that customer's posts, and then all of those posts, that metadata that comes with those posts into it. So if those blog posts had custom fields assigned to them or custom meta values, then we would pull all that in. So I'm going to save this, go back to the browser, And then here in the browser, we will refresh the page and we'll see that we have posts. And as we scroll down, we don't have any custom metadata on these blog posts, but this one does. It's using a default template somehow. So that's pretty neat. And it looks like this is a page. It's not actually a blog post. So it's pulling in pages and posts. So for this particular instance, it's not scoping the posts to specific post type of post. It's just getting all the posts. So something nice to know about that. And yeah, essentially this is how we can use those database relationships to do some really interesting things. So let's jump back to the code and sort of review where we've started and how we got here. So we started out with this custom database table, flights, that we created in our migration. Then we created a model for this seat post type, which we haven't created yet. I have dummy data in here, and that's why it pulled up in our example. But we will create a post type in terms of registering it in WordPress using, register post type, I believe. Just trying not to confuse you, but also trying to move quickly, right? So if we had registered a seat post type, then okay, WordPress knows it exists and we'll get a UI for it. But again, I have dummy data in here for us already. So that's why we don't have that quite yet, but we do have a model for it. And so we've done that through this table, and we're scoping it to the post type because we don't have multiple tables. And then users, we don't really need to do anything special here. We can just have users automatically set up. Now that we have seen how all these relationships work, what we can do with this is we can build our own applications, right? We can say, hey, now that I know these different types of relationships that can take place, I can begin to wire together my own processes. Hey, maybe you want an extra database table for that flight system and you want to connect it to something else. You can do that. Maybe you don't want to save your meta information to the WP meta fields. Maybe you want to create that as a custom database table and save your information to a separate table so it's easier to query, it's faster, that sort of thing. So these models are quite powerful in how they can allow us to interact with a database. And then as we move through, we'll see how we can connect these models to more interesting things in terms of user interface. So table lists and input forms. So in the next video, we'll look at essentially setting up the controller for the flights, and then we'll move through into the other steps, which includes building out that seats post type. And we may actually start there first, is with the seats post type, just to get that set up and set it aside so then we can move into the seat section or the flight section.